On a cold February morning in 2019, David Thornton packed his BMW and drove away from his Connecticut home, leaving behind his wife of 18 years and their 3 children. He told them he needed to find himself with his yoga instructor in California. But David didn't anticipate what his abandoned wife, Rache, would do next. Within 18 months, her memoir would sell over 2 million copies, exposing every detail of his deception to the world. His quest for a new beginning became a public reckoning that would follow him forever. This is the story of how one woman turned betrayal into a bestseller, and how a husband's secrets became everyone's business. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. From the outside, the Thornton family appeared to have everything. Their 5-bedroom colonial home in Greenwich, Connecticut, sat on 2 manicured acres with a swimming pool and tennis court. David was a successful financial advisor, managing portfolios worth hundreds of millions. Rachel had given up her career as a marketing executive to raise their 3 children, Sophia, 16, James, 14, and Lily, 11. Their Christmas cards showed a family in coordinating outfits, smiling against scenic backdrops. They attended the country club, hosted dinner parties, and took annual vacations to Martha's Vineyard. To their neighbors, to their friends, to their own extended families, they represented the American dream achieved. But perfection is often a performance, and behind the Thorntons' front door, cracks had been forming for years. David worked increasingly long hours, often not returning home until after the children were asleep. When he was present, he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone, stepping out for mysterious calls. Rachel noticed but rationalized. The financial industry was demanding. Stress was normal. Every marriage has its challenges. The warning signs accumulated slowly, almost imperceptibly. There were unexplained charges on credit card statements, charges David dismissed as client entertainment. There were weekend conferences that seemed to multiply, business trips that extended without warning. Rachel would later write in her memoir that she had become an expert at not seeing what was directly in front of her, because acknowledging it would mean confronting a truth too devastating to accept. Friends would later recall moments that, in hindsight, seemed significant. At a summer barbecue, David had spent the entire afternoon on his phone in the garage. At their daughter's piano recital, he had left halfway through, claiming an emergency at work. During their 18th anniversary dinner, he had seemed absent, pushing food around his plate, barely engaging in conversation. Rachel had made excuses for him to everyone, including herself. The transformation in David had been gradual but undeniable. The man who had once surprised Rachel with handwritten love notes now barely looked up when she entered a room. The father who had coached Little League now missed most of his son's games. The husband who had promised to grow old with her now seemed to be aging in a different direction entirely. What Rachel didn't know was that David had been living a double life for nearly 2 years. His client dinners were dates with Amanda, a 32-year-old yoga instructor he had met at a wellness retreat his company had sponsored. His weekend conferences were trips to her apartment in Manhattan. His distraction wasn't work stress. It was the exhaustion of maintaining 2 separate existences. The facade might have continued indefinitely if not for a simple mistake. On January 15th, 2019, David left his laptop open on the kitchen counter. Rachel, looking for a recipe she had bookmarked, clicked on a browser. The email account that appeared wasn't his work email. It was a personal Gmail account she had never seen before. The messages were all from Amanda. They detailed not just an affair, but plans for a future together. Messages about looking at apartments in San Diego. Discussions about David's timeline for leaving. References to after the divorce. Rachel would later describe that moment in her memoir as feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath her. In an instant, 18 years of marriage, of shared history, of built trust evaporated. The perfect life she thought she had been living was revealed as an elaborate fiction. She printed every email. She took screenshots of every message. Not because she was planning anything yet, but because she needed proof that this was real, that the life she thought she knew had actually been a carefully constructed lie. Chapter 2. the unraveling. The confrontation came 3 days after Rachel's discovery. She had spent those days in a state of suspended animation, continuing the routine of family life while processing the demolition of everything she had believed. She made breakfasts, drove carpools, and attended Lily's parent-teacher conference. But inside, she was strategizing. She consulted a divorce attorney in secret. She opened her own bank account. She documented everything. When she finally confronted David, it was after the children had gone to bed on January 18th. She placed the printed emails on the kitchen island between them. For a moment, he tried to deny it, then minimize it, then explain it away. But faced with the evidence, his elaborate construction of lies collapsed. What followed was not the remorse Rachel had expected, but something far more devastating: relief. David was relieved to finally stop pretending. He didn't apologize. Instead, he talked about feeling trapped, about losing himself in the responsibilities of family life, about needing to rediscover who he really was. He used phrases that sounded like they came from self-help books: authentic self, personal journey, spiritual awakening. He spoke about Amanda not as an affair partner, but as his true soulmate, someone who understood the person he was meant to be. Rachel would later write that listening to him was like watching a stranger wearing her husband's face, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The conversation lasted until 3 in the morning. David revealed the full extent of his deception. The wellness retreat where he met Amanda hadn't been a company event. He had sought it out himself, already searching for something different. The money he had been siphoning from their joint accounts wasn't for investments, but for the future he was building without her. The late nights at the office had often been spent at Amanda's apartment, just 20 miles away from where his family waited for him to come home. But the most shocking revelation came at the end. David announced he was leaving immediately, not in weeks or months, but in days. He had already signed a lease on an apartment in San Diego. Amanda had lined up yoga studios where she could teach. He had arranged to work remotely for select clients. The new life he had been planning wasn't a fantasy. It was ready and waiting for him to step into it. Rachel begged him to consider the children. Sophia was preparing for college applications. James had just made varsity basketball. Lily was struggling with anxiety that had recently required therapy. But David's response was clinical, detached. He would provide financial support. He would maintain contact through video calls. He would see them on holidays. He spoke about his children as obligations to be managed rather than relationships to be cherished. Over the next week, David systematically extracted himself from their life. He packed methodically, taking things Rachel hadn't even realized he cared about. Art pieces they had bought together on their honeymoon, first edition books she had given him for anniversaries, even photo albums from their early years. It was as if he was curating the parts of their history he wanted to keep, editing out the rest. The children's reactions ranged from disbelief to rage to desperate bargaining. Sophia refused to speak to him, locking herself in her room when he tried to explain. James punched a hole in his bedroom wall, then broke down crying in Rachel's arms. Lily became convinced it was her fault, that if she had been easier, better, less anxious, her father would have stayed. David's attempts to explain his decision to them were tone-deaf, filled with the same self-help jargon he had used with Rachel. He told them this was actually good for them, that they would learn independence, that they would understand when they were older. The morning he left, that cold February morning, was surreal in its ordinariness. He loaded his BMW while the family watched from the window. Neighbors heading to work waved, unaware they were witnessing the end of an 18-year marriage. David had told the children he would call that evening, but he didn't. He would later claim he needed time to transition. Rachel would discover through her lawyer that he and Amanda had flown to Costa Rica that same day for what social media posts called their journey of rebirth. Chapter 3: The Transformation. In the weeks following David's departure, Rachel existed in a fog of devastation. She moved through the necessary motions of life, getting the children to school, meeting with divorce attorneys, fielding calls from shocked friends and family. But inside, she was drowning. She lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks. She found herself standing in grocery stores, unable to remember what she needed. She would wake at 3 in the morning, her body still reaching for the empty space beside her, the muscle memory of 18 years not yet adjusted to abandonment. But it was during one of these sleepless nights, 6 weeks after David left, that something shifted. Rachel found herself at her computer, and instead of scrolling through old photos or checking David's social media for glimpses of his new life, she opened a blank document and began to type. The words poured out, raw, unfiltered, angry. She wrote about finding the emails, about the confrontation, about watching him pack. She wrote about the lies she had told herself, the signs she had ignored, the perfect life that had been anything but perfect. By morning, she had written 20 pages. It was therapeutic in a way that her mandated therapy sessions hadn't been. On paper, she could say the things she couldn't speak aloud. She could be furious without worrying about traumatizing the children. She could be devastated without maintaining the brave face everyone expected. The writing became her lifeline, her 3 a.m. companion, her way of making sense of the incomprehensible. What started as private journaling evolved into something more structured. Rachel began organizing her thoughts chronologically, adding context, exploring not just what happened but why she hadn't seen it coming. She examined her own complicity in maintaining the facade, the way she had enabled David's deception by refusing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. She wrote about the societal pressure to project perfection, about the shame of failure in a community where divorce was discussed in whispers. 3 months into writing, Rachel's sister, a literary agent in New York, visited for a weekend. She found Rachel at the computer, surrounded by printed pages, notebooks, and legal documents. When she read what Rachel had written, she sat in stunned silence. Then she said words that would change everything. "This needs to be published." Rachel's initial reaction was horror. These were her private thoughts, her family's intimate catastrophe. But her sister argued that Rachel's story wasn't unique, it was universal. How many women were living Rachel's former life, ignoring red flags, maintaining facades, enabling their own deception? How many were dealing with abandonment, trying to hold families together while processing betrayal? Rachel's story could help them feel less alone, less ashamed, less invisible. The process of transforming personal catharsis into a publishable memoir was grueling. Rachel worked with a professional editor who pushed her to go deeper, to examine not just David's betrayal but her own journey. She had to revisit painful moments with clinical detachment, fact-check her emotional memories, and consider the legal implications of every revelation. She struggled with how much to reveal about the children's pain, ultimately deciding to focus primarily on her own experience while protecting their privacy. Finding a publisher proved easier than expected. Rachel's sister leveraged her connections, and within weeks, they had multiple offers. Editors saw the commercial potential immediately. The memoir market was hungry for authentic stories of female resilience, and Rachel's combination of privileged suburban setting and raw emotional honesty was compelling. The fact that David had left for such a cliched scenario, the younger yoga instructor, the spiritual awakening, the midlife crisis, made it both relatable and slightly absurd. The publisher who ultimately won the bidding war was known for turning personal memoirs into cultural phenomena. They saw Rachel's story not just as a divorce memoir, but as a commentary on modern marriage, female identity, and the performance of perfect family life in the social media age. They paired her with a publicist who had worked on several best-selling memoirs and began planning a marketing campaign that would position the book as the next must-read for book clubs across America. Rachel titled the book "The Husband I Never Knew," a memoir of deception and discovery. She dedicated it to her children and to every woman who had ever made herself smaller to accommodate someone else's fiction. As she signed the publishing contract, she felt something she hadn't experienced since finding those emails: power. David had taken their story and shattered it. Now, she was taking the pieces and building something entirely her own. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. The Husband I Never Knew hit bookstores on September 15th, 2020, and within 48 hours, it had sold out of its initial print run of 50,000 copies. By the end of the first week, it had climbed to number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. By the end of the month, it was number 1. Rache's raw, unflinching account of marital deception resonated with readers in ways neither she nor her publisher had fully anticipated. The media explosion was immediate and intense. Rache appeared on morning shows, her story of betrayal and resilience striking a chord with millions of viewers. Book clubs across the country selected it as their monthly read. Social media exploded with hashtags like #The Husband I Never Knew and #Rache Told Her Truth. Women shared their own stories of deception and abandonment in response, creating a viral movement around the book. Online forums dissected every chapter, with readers particularly fixated on the warning signs Rache had documented, creating lists titled Red Flags We All Ignore. But it was David's reaction that transformed the book from bestseller to sensation. 2 weeks after publication, he emerged from his California silence with a cease and desist letter, claiming defamation and invasion of privacy. His attorneys argued that Rache had violated their divorce agreement's confidentiality clause and demanded that the book be pulled from the shelves immediately. The legal threat backfired spectacularly. Media outlets that might have ignored the book now covered it extensively. Sales doubled overnight. The attempted suppression became the story, making David look like exactly the controlling, image-obsessed man Rache had described. When legal threats failed, David tried a different approach. He gave an exclusive interview to a men's lifestyle magazine, attempting to tell his side of the story. He painted himself as misunderstood, claimed Rache had exaggerated and taken things out of context, and insisted their marriage had been dead for years before he left. He spoke about personal growth, finding authentic happiness, and the courage it took to pursue true love. But his polished, therapy-speak responses only reinforced Rache's portrayal of him as emotionally disconnected and self-absorbed. The interview's comment section became a battlefield, with readers eviscerating his justifications. Amanda, the yoga instructor, found herself thrust into the unwanted spotlight. Though Rache had changed her name in the book, internet detectives quickly identified her. Her Instagram account, previously filled with sunrise yoga poses and inspirational quotes, was bombarded with angry messages. Her yoga studios began receiving one-star reviews from people who had never attended a class. She was forced to go private on all social media platforms and eventually lost her teaching positions at 2 prominent studios. The spiritual community she had cultivated rejected her, viewing her as a home wrecker rather than the enlightened soul she portrayed herself to be. The professional consequences for David were severe. Several major clients pulled their portfolios after reading the book, uncomfortable with the detailed deception it revealed. His firm, concerned about reputation damage, transferred him to a back-office role with no client contact. The country club where he had maintained membership for 15 years quietly suggested he might be happier elsewhere. Former colleagues distanced themselves, and invitations to industry events stopped arriving. The new beginning he had envisioned in California became an isolation he hadn't anticipated. For Rache, success brought its own complications. While the book's royalties provided financial security she hadn't expected, the public attention was overwhelming. Strangers approached her in grocery stores to share their own stories of betrayal. Her children faced questions at school about intimate family details their classmates had learned from their parents' book clubs. Sophia, now in college, struggled with boys who had Googled her family and knew her father's abandonment story before they knew her. James refused to read the book, but had to live with everyone else having read it. Lily's therapist reported she was struggling with the public nature of their private pain. The book's impact extended beyond the Thornton family. It sparked a broader conversation about modern marriage, emotional labor, and the ways women are conditioned to ignore their instincts. Universities added it to psychology and sociology reading lists. Divorce attorneys reported clients arriving with copies, using Rache's documentation methods as templates for their own cases. Publishers rushed to sign similar memoirs, creating a subgenre of revenge memoirs by scorned spouses. 18 months after publication, with over 2 million copies sold and a television adaptation in development, Rachel reflected on what her transformation had cost and gained. She had turned betrayal into triumph, private pain into public power. David's quest for a new beginning had indeed created one, just not the one he had planned. Rachel Thornton's story shows how betrayal can become a best-selling revenge and how one woman's truth can expose 1,000 lies. If you found this story compelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more true crime documentaries.